Hello, my name is Danielfarid Fearn Holden, and now I would like to go over my code for my Programming Principles Tic-Tac-Toe project. Alright, so here are just some screenshots from terminal outputs, and here is the function hierarchy, which I will go over now. You can see that main calls start menu, and start menu calls everything else. Thus we'll investigate start menu first. Basically, what start menu is start menu is sort of like one of those start menus you see at the very beginning of games. It's got like play game, it's got clear history, it's got options, quit, etc. So I've sectioned it off into variable initialization, display, and process. Variable initialization is mainly for the while loop in the process section, and display basically outputs in the terminal the title and also the menu, so that processing can call start select, which basically prompts the user for a selection, right? And then based off of that selection, it can decide what to do. So it can either call clear log, or it can start the game, or it can quit the game. All right, so we're going to go over start select, which basically why it's another function is because let's say in the previous example, right, we wanted to start the game, but instead we typed 2 and we accidentally cleared our history. When we choose 2, there's a reconfirmation, right? So in case you didn't want to actually do that, so you can not confirm this, and then basically instead of having to repeat the code to call it, the function would just be called again. So that's why we've called it, or we've defined it in a separate function. Using try, except, and else if statements, the input is validated, right? And basically it's either in 1, 2, or 3, and it returns that back to the start menu so that the start menu can process it. Right, then we move over to clear log, which is option 2 for the selection menu, and basically what it does is it overwrites any existing data currently in the text file with blank white space, or with just nothing, right? So it just clears the entire thing, and then we move over to the main thing, which is the game function, right? And the main function within game functions is called play game. Play game calls every other function in there. You can see at the very beginning there on the left, it says main while loop initialize. So the main loop, the very first thing done is the main while loop is initialized. Basically what this does is it allows the player to determine whether he wants to play another game after the game is finished, right? The file initialization is to determine what game the current game is. So let's say we open the text file and the previous game recorded was game 4, the new game recorded would be game 5, and then it would write that into the file. We've got variable initialization, which is when the game actually starts, right? So we initialize it so that the game finished is false, right? And that game finished is false would only update to true when an end game state has been made. Game board is initialized to all empty tiles, right? And the move count is initialized to 0. We've also got players is assigned players there, and that's important because we want to randomly select who goes first. It's going to be boring if he always goes first, or the computer goes first. So that basically decides who player 1 is, who player 2 is. Right, then it processes the move, so basically move count goes up by 1 before a move is made, and the game board is basically updated as the result of the next move. So next move is basically a function that determines whether the next move is the user move or computer move, and we're going to go over that now, or after this. And then in the end game, we have the final statements, which are a display board, so it displays the final state of the board once the game is finished. And depending on whether it was a win, tie, or loss, different outputs can be made to either congratulate or console the user. Right? Then the file closes, and the reason why the file closes before the while loop is exited is because we want to update that file every time a new game is restarted, so that the new game number can be made. So for example, if the previous game was played 5 and he wants to restart it, the file would have to close to update the file to make it game 5, and then the new game would be game 6. Then we've got assigned players, which I mentioned before. It's just using rand int and a player list, and it basically randomly selects index 0 or 1 of player list to determine whether it's computer or user. We've got next move, which basically if the player is computer, then it would do computer move, otherwise it's not, it's user move, right? And computer move, basically what it does is it uses rand int again to determine a random row or column. Based off of this position, we check whether it's an empty tile. If it is an empty tile, it's considered valid and the board is updated. Otherwise, new random row and column is selected. Right, user move, instead of using rand int, we use input to prompt the user for what row and column they want. So based off of that, we can check the tile to see whether it's valid, or we can even check to see whether the input is valid, as in if it's in the range of numbers, right? If it's not, we could say invalid. If it is, it's true. The game board updates, right? And then the board is returned so that play game can process the data. Lastly, one more thing, we have check finished. Basically, check finished is done anytime a move is made. So anytime next move is called, check finished is called, because it checks the board for to see whether any end game state has been made. So it checks every row to see whether it's got 3 X's or O's, checks every column, checks every diagonal, and also those are only the win conditions. It also checks if those win conditions have not been met, Have all the tiles been filled? If all the tiles have been filled, then yeah, it's a tie. Otherwise, no, the game is not finished and the game continues. Lastly, we've got display board, which basically displays the current state of the board every time a move is made, so it helps the user make a selection. It's just using for loops and generator functions. Lastly, we've got the main function, which just calls the start menu function. The start menu functions, as mentioned before, calls everything else, so the main function is very short. Just def main, start menu, and you call main. And that's it. Thank you very much. I hope it was fun.